My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression. And I'd like to welcome you to today's seventh in this fall's series of Center for Free Expression conversations. I want to begin, however, by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Our conversation today is titled Accountable Us, Journalists' Professional Standards in an Era of Ungated Content. And it's being co-sponsored by the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton Public Library, the Ryerson Journalism Research Center, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. And I want to thank our 5 co-sponsors. Today's conversation will feature 2 people, particularly well suited for this topic, whom I'd like to introduce to you now. The first is Ivor Shapiro. Ivor is Emeritus Professor in the School of Journalism at Ryerson University, and he's a Senior Fellow with the Center for Free Expression. His research is in the professional practice of and attitudes of journalists. As a magazine journalist, Ivor was the contributing editor of Saturday Night Magazine and has been the managing editor of Chatelaine. He is a former chair of the Ethics Committee of the Canadian Association of Journalists and the founding editor of JSource. He is currently working on a book about the freedom of the press. Welcome, Ivor. Our second panelist is Susan Harada. Susan is an associate professor of journalism at Carleton University. She's currently on sabbatical after serving 6 years as head of the journalism program, first as associate director from 2014 to 2019, and then as interim director in 2019-2020. She joined the school after nearly 2 decades of working in journalism, mainly with the CBC in a multiplicity of positions as a current affairs reporter, a documentary journalist, a parliamentary correspondent, a news anchor, and host. She is a founding member and current chair of J Schools Canada, the organization that brings together post-secondary journalism programs across the country. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, Jim.
The format for today's event is going to be a conversation between Susan and Ivor. After about 45 to 55 minutes, we're going to turn to the audience for any questions you may have of Susan and Ivor. So if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. If at any point in their conversation, a question comes to mind that you would like to ask them, just click on that button and write out your question. You don't have to wait till we turn to the audience. You can do it as the question comes to mind. And then at the appropriate time, Susan will turn to Ange Holmes, the center's coordinator, for the first questions come from the audience, and we'll go through them at that point. I think that's all I have to say. So over to our 2 conversationalists, and we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And hello, Ivor. And welcome to everybody from Ottawa, where I'm located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation. Now, as Jim mentioned, I'm on sabbatical, so I am taking a break personally from Twitter. But I understand from Ivor that he is not. In fact, he's been tweeting today, promising to deliver things that will shock his friends, and he promises not to be polite about it, which will be the first time I've ever seen Ivor not polite. But before we get to Ivor Unplugged, I want to start with the title of this talk, which is Accountable Us, Journalists' Professional Standards in an Era of Ungated Content. Now, there's a lot packed into that title, and we are going to be unpacking all of it in the course of our conversation, everything from the idea of accountability to the notion of who us is, how do we define journalists, as well as the idea of professional standards and what are they, who do they apply to. Before we dive into all of that, though, Ivor, I want to ask you why you chose this particular loaded title and why you think it's important that we talk about these things right now.
Well, some of us have colleagues, I think, Susan, who like to say there's a headline for that. And sometimes the implication is just stop with the headline. Well, the headline for that might be, you know, the federal leaders debate clusterfuck. Why have we gotten to a point in this country where we still don't know what a journalist is? Why have we gotten to the point in this country where the idea that anybody can be a journalist is the last word on the subject of who is a journalist? I think over the years, my position on this matter, like my thoughts on this matter have changed, have gone 180 degrees. And in the recent months, you know, I just feel like we can no longer avoid that question, and we can no longer afford as Canadians to be to have such inertia and to have such complacency as Canadian journalists as to think that the ways in which we have thought about that question, who is a journalist, and the ways in which we have thought about the press and who is entitled to the freedoms of the press have to remain the only ways of thinking about those things.
Okay, so let's get back to the federal leaders debate. You are referring, of course, to the issue of accreditation for Rebel News and for a journalist from True North. This was something that was at issue in 2019 for the debates then. It was settled by the courts. It again came up in 2021 and again settled by the courts, not by journalists. So walk us through that. Why did you think it was such a debacle?
Well, it was a debacle in some ways, just because of the fact that in two elections running, as you said, this matter had to go to the court at the last minute for an urgent interlocutive injunction from the Federal Court of Canada to tell the Federal Debates Commission to accredit Rebel News as a news medium, as a organization that has journalists involved. Every attempt by anybody to say to the contrary was on such slippery ground that it couldn't pass the test of a judge. And then we sit through the debate, of course, and some of us thought it was a good debate, and some of us thought it was a terrible debate, and some of us thought someone won, and all that stuff. That's all standard. But for those of us who stayed tuned or looked back later on the press conferences after the debate, where the accredited journalists were given an opportunity to ask supplementary questions, holding the leaders of all five parties to account. This, by the way, I'm referring to the English debate in all of these numbers. Mm-hmm. You had a situation where Rebel News itself had 4 questions.
Right.
There were a total of 32 questions to be asked of politicians. 4 of them, you can work out the percentages, came from Rebel News. A few of them came from other news media that a lot of people would have thought of as quite marginal, dubious news media, where the journalistic credentials of the journalists were at stake. And then, you know, a total of 18 questions came from what one might call established legacy media, a total of 3, but these are my counts, and I could well be wrong, but that's roughly true. A total of 3 came from what we might call new media, you know, the media that are not legacy media, and 4 from foreign media, and that's not a problem at all, obviously. So, I mean, is this really the best we can do in Canada today? And that's not the only time, as you know, that courts have been asked to settle the question of who is a journalist, because we as journalists really, in my opinion, refuse to give the government or the courts any guidance on how to make that distinction.
although the Debates Commission, and I'm sure everyone knows about this, but just a reminder to people listening, the Debates Commission in both 2019 and 2021 did set some guidelines, more thoroughly in 2021 for sure. And the line that was drawn was at advocacy. So we can get into that in a moment, but I did want to make the point that in fact, there had been an attempt by the commission to set what those rules should be. And the commission depended on the CAJ, for example, or other professional associations. Is that right? Is that there's a theme going through there about advocacy?
Well, it's complicated, right? As any important thing always is. The commission in 2021, it seems, tried really hard to have an objective standard by which it would set the accreditation, put accreditation line in place, who is a journalist. And as you say, they reached out to other organizations, the Canadian Association of Journalists, and I suspect many others, for help in setting that standard. What they, and I'm sure did the very best they could, given what we, and when I say we, I'm talking about Canadian journalists, okay? Given what we had given them, I think the commission did as best it could. Let me be clear, the Federal Debates Commission is not, it's not like the consortium of journalists that do this, consortium of, broadcasters who do this in the United States, with huge success, as we know. He said, raising his eyes, you know, but this is now, and has been for some years, an arm of the Crown. Okay, the Federal Debates Commission is an agent of the Crown. It is a creature of the Prime Minister's office, okay? An official organization that decides everything to do with the debates. Now, to its credit, the commission has tried, it seems to me very honestly, to do this work, all of this work, as far as I can see, to the best of its capacity in an independent way. So to present an independent debate and to accredit journalists in an independent way. So they go to us, they come to us, the journalists, and say, help us out. And they come up with a three-way test for a journalist to be accredited. I'm sorry, that's not quite the right word, because they're really, it's a three-gate. They put up three gates to accreditation. One, very objective, if you're a member of the Canadian Association of Journalists or of the Fédération de Journalistes du Québec, then you're in. Two, if you work for a news media organization that is a member of one of the two press councils in this country, the National News Media Council and the Conseil de Presse de Québec, you're in. But then realizing there were other legitimate journalists in Canada, who had never been required for any reason to join a press association. They might be unionized members of a journalist, of a news medium, but maybe that news medium not a member of one of the two councils. They may be people who've been doing journalism all of their lives and still do as freelancers and so forth. For one reason or another, they don't get in gate 1 or gate 2. Oh, and by the way, they could also be foreigners, right? Foreign press coming in.
Right.
Okay, well, then we'll put up another gate for you. And that's where the problem was. So the Debates Commission now says, okay, for gate 3, we want to guard against advocates. We want to distinguish between journalists and advocates. Not something they had done with gates 1 or 2, by the way, but for gates 3, we're going to distinguish between this. And how will we distinguish between this? We will look at the Canadian Association of Journalists definitions and policies, and we, the commission, will decide one by one whom we will accredit. Are they a journalist or are they an advocate? Well,
and central to that was the whole idea of conflict of interest, though, right? The debate commission specified the need for an absence of conflict of interest, which was defined as being when the media organization or journalist becomes an active participant in the story that they're covering. This does echo CAJ guidelines, as you point out.
Exactly.
So what is your issue with that?
What my issue is with that is that what we have is a government agent deciding, adjudicating who is in conflict of interest based on looking at their work. I don't really have any issue with the results they came up with. You know, I think they were quite generous in their accreditation. But in principle, are we content with having an agent of the Crown deciding who is in conflict or not? And I think the answer to that is probably clear. I do not think that's a very good idea at all. More to the point, nor did the Federal Court of Canada think that that this standard was an objective one that could be properly adjudicated by an agent of the Crown.
Right. In fact, the court noted in 2019 that the commission didn't provide a rationale as to why some types of advocacy do not impact accreditation while others do. So your objection is to the fact that the debates commission, and it was the court that was providing this. Now, what about the CAJ's own guidelines, if you will, that lay out what it is acceptable for journalists to do and what is not acceptable? Because again, the debates commission was leaning on distinctions made by the CAJ, as well as others like the CBC and the Canadian Press.
Well, the CAJ guidelines are just a potload of garbage. I don't know who wrote those things.
Says the man who helped write them. In fact, was in charge of writing them. I believe you led the group that formulated these guidelines. Thank
you. 2011, 11 years ago, right? So 11 years ago, the Canadian Association of Journalists puts in its best efforts to create quite a long, not to create, actually to revise its previous edition and to establish principles for ethical journalism. Okay, so guidelines and principles, and I think, you know, I hope that was a pretty good job in 2011. They had also somewhere around that time in 2012, I believe, tried to define what journalism is. We might have to get back into that whole thing of trying to define who a journalist is and what a journalist, what journalism is. But, you know, these were the documents that the debates commission relied upon. And as I've said, my problem is not, well, not as I've said, I guess to answer your question, my problem is not with the documents. My problem is with the debates commission adjudicating on an individual basis around any document and around any standard. But in terms of the document, we have to note that they were written in 2011 last. Now, I do understand from the president of the CAJ, Brent Jolly, that these documents are being updated as we speak, well, certainly the guidelines and the principles, and that's great, and no doubt they'll change. There are, but you know, the key question that you, Susan, highlighted was, what's the difference between an advocate and a journalist, right? Now, as you say, we can come back to the substantive answer to that question if you like, but we can say at this moment that the idea of distinguishing between journalism and advocacy in the year 2021 is somewhat evolved from that same idea in 2011. Indeed, in my opinion, we haven't really attacked the question as journalists in this country for decades.
Okay, I'd like to get into that in more detail as a jumping off point. The CAJ's ethical guidelines are clear on the issue of advocacy, and for the benefit of everyone here, they say we don't participate in movements and activities that we cover, and editorial boards and columnists or commentators endorse political candidates or causes. Reporters do not. Now, do you take issue with that? Is that outdated?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily for me as one person to say whether to take issue with it, but outdated. I mean, for sure, there are many journalists, and indeed many journalists working for news organizations that are accredited to not only the Debates Commission, but to the courts in Canada, and are accountable to the National News Media Council of Canada and the Conseil de Presse de Quebec. And we have journalists working for all of these people who have endorsed movements, you know, and whose status as a journalist is not seriously questioned by anyone. You know, Rebel News itself, in its, I really hope we don't continue to talk about Rebel News for the rest of our period together, because I'd probably throw up by the end of that. But the Rebel News itself, in their submission to the court, pointed out, this was in 2019, and presumably, they presumably just recycled the same submission in 2020. Well, they wouldn't have, there's different criteria involved. But they pointed out, look, you're saying advocates are not allowed? Let's just look, shall we, for example, at the mandate of the Toronto Star, which is online and which is dedicated to the Atkinson's principles and is dedicated to the advancement of certain liberal ideas. Advocates not allowed? Okay, tell us how you make that distinction, you know. So you have to, we now realize that these questions are more complicated than they used to be, because partly, I think, Susan, for the first time, we're beginning to kind of scratch our heads over these questions. There was no question when you and I, when you were working for the National and the Journal at CBC, and I was managing editor at Chatelaine, there was no question in anybody's mind in any serious way about who a journalist is or what journalism was. All of that is up for grabs now. Let's, you know, I think we would all recognize that because, of course, of our different landscape. We have tons of ways to be a journalist in this world right now. And you don't have to be working for the CBC or any title that anyone has ever heard of in order to be a legitimate journalist. You know, can I just say one more thing?
Sure. Right. The front page with the story about the two independent journalists in BC who were recently arrested and detained by the RCMP, not let go.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Now, is there any question in my mind that these people were journalists? Definitely not. Okay, definitely not. Is there any question in my mind that a court, if it had come to decide whether they were journalists or not, would have decided they're journalists, as it did, for example, in the case of, the appeals court of Newfoundland and Labrador decided in,
Justin Brake.
Justin Brake, yeah, I knew the name, but the date, 2019 or so?
The decision was 2019, yeah, I believe.
Yeah, now a court had to engage with the question of, is this guy a protester involved with an advocate for Indigenous people's freedom and land, or is this guy a journalist? Okay, a court had ruled on that. It was appealed. It went to the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador, and the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador had to decide whether he was a journalist or not. In my opinion, the right call. They decided he was a journalist. But seriously, is that how we want to resolve these matters in this country? Can we not give them some help?
By professional journalists coming up with these definitions themselves. All right, so before we move.
I would say more than just definitions, you see. I would say we can get well beyond sort of abstract sentences that say, this is what we think a journalist is. I think we can get well beyond that. Okay,
so let's return to Justin Brake. I realize it's not the newest. It was a 2016 event, 2019 court ruling. What the court did emphasize was the fact that Brake was doing his job as a journalist. He was observing. He was not a participant. Mm-hmm. So that idea in and of itself, is that an issue? Do you take issue with that idea?
I think the court came up with a great, made a perfectly reasonable decision in the end. I think what we have to understand, I mean, look, let's stop kidding ourselves. There are good cops and there are bad cops. There are cops who will arrest people in a situation that is inflamed, right? And who might say this person is a pain in the ass, not a journalist, right? Of course, you and I know that you can actually be both in theory.
Yes. So let's get back though to the idea, Ivor, of conflict of interest, of advocacy, of needing to come to terms, professional journalists come to terms with this. Where do you draw the line? When does it become a conflict? If Justin Brake had in fact been a participant, but didn't happen to be reporting that day, is that okay? If he in fact was reporting, but also participating, is that okay? Where are the lines drawn?
It's a terribly tough line to draw, right? And not just courts have been involved in drawing that line, but news organizations have been involved in drawing that line for many years. Way back to, I think back, Susan, you know what I think back? I think back to gay marriage. Remember when gay marriage was a question rather than an answer? Well, at that time, there were news organizations that said to reporters, you can't report on this controversy going on in our country, right? Why not? Well, like you're gay, aren't you, right? So you have a conflict of interest, right? And there's never been, in my recollection, there's never been a good, clean answer on the question of advocacy. I believe that these and yes, of course, as we go on, as more movements come along, Black Lives Matter, obviously, there are thousands of journalists in this country, I suspect, who have in some way or another declared their opinion that Black Lives Matter is a movement with a cause that is highly important and vital to our future as a democracy, right? Well, does that, okay, so now you can't actually report on anything that touches on racial injustice anymore? Well, that would be absurd, right? And the examples just go on. And of course, what we've been talking about here is the issue of Indigenous land and the rights of Indigenous people to their land versus the rights of energy companies to, have pipelines on that land. These are complicated matters. And I don't know that there's any doubt that people like, well, actually, you know what? I actually don't know what Amber Bracken thinks about that issue. Okay. But let's just say, for example, well, we do know what Justin Brake thinks about that issue, right? And the court said, well, yeah, that's what he thinks, and that's what he has tweeted, but he wasn't there as an advocate on that day, okay? Which, again, is a kind of sort of commonsensical line that the court chose to draw with him. But we've seen other situations. I mentioned the name of Desmond Cole, right? Desmond Cole fired by, well, not fired, actually, technically. He stepped down at the Toronto Star, but, in everybody's interpretation of that incident, clearly the marriage between Desmond Cole and the Toronto Star had become uncomfortable. Toronto Star is aforementioned a newspaper which prides itself on advocating for justice, and that had encouraged and paid him to do important, brilliant work as a journalist, investigating and exposing police carding of Black people in the city that I'm standing in. But then he became too much of an advocate for the Toronto Star, clearly, and it became uncomfortable. Well, that's for the Toronto Star to sort out, of course, because Torstar is the corporation that runs the Toronto Star as a business and as a newspaper, and it can choose where it draws its lines. Again, freedom of the press. Well, the old saying goes, freedom of the press is, what is that old saying about if you own one? I can't remember exactly who said it, or someone famous in America who said it, who said, freedom of the press is good for everyone who can afford to own a press. That's actually a paraphrase. It's not the actual words were more elegant. Well, the problem always has been what that means in effect. If freedom of the press is only for the owners of the presses, and they get to decide the standards for tough questions like the one we're talking about, well, then we get the press that they can sell, that they can make money off. But of course, now freedom of the press isn't, the press isn't that anymore at all. The press doesn't even involve presses, right? So, or major newscasts and things that cost millions of dollars to produce, like anyone can start a news medium. And a lot of people have started news media that have contributed to our democracy ideas and information that otherwise wouldn't be at our disposal. So who sets the standards?
That's a really good question about setting professional standards. Before we get to where in the world there are examples of how this might work, I think it's worth mentioning NPR, National Public Radio, recently updated its own ethics guidelines about things such as participating in marches and rallies and other public events, and is broadening what it's the leeway that it's giving to its journalists. NPR's public editor noted, where does the journalist end and the citizen begin? And this is something that they were tussling with. So the updated policy means NPR editorial staff, their journalists, can express support for democratic civic values that are core to NPR's work. This includes freedom and dignity of human beings. It includes the rights of a free and independent press, the right to thrive in society without being discriminated against on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, disability, or religion. So this was groundbreaking for a major media organization. But it still puts the brackets on it by saying, so you can march in a pride parade. You can sign petitions for sidewalks in your neighborhoods. These are NPR's examples.
Mm-hmm.
Ask for funding for local concerns. Participate in community matters as long as journalists are not responsible for covering the issues. So they're still putting that distance there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a step in the right direction. Would you take it a step further?
Well, I sort of think that the way in which a corporation, including a publicly owned corporation like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the CBC in this country, when a corporation sort of tries to draw lines that are difficult, that's their right to do. The CBC has had equal failure trying to draw these lines in the past, and I don't think we're done with that question. My own feeling is that the entire idea of advocacy versus journalism is old. It's old. And we are still, Susan, I'll tell you what, I think that one of the problems in this country, particularly in the way in which we think about questions of standards and professionalism in journalism, is that we have a baby boomer problem. People, I don't know how old you are, Susan, you're ageless, but I certainly am a baby boomer, not yet the late end of the baby boom, which is sad. But, we have people that we are still, the people who own or manage or publish most influential news organizations in this country are people my age or around my age or older than my age, bringing old assumptions and old ideas of how news media can operate and make money, and old confidence in the way in which we think, such as, for example, you can't be an advocate and a journalist, overconfidence in it, and it all is kind of filtered through the privilege that people my age in major news organizations in this country have got. These ideas are old. They're gone. They're yesterday's ideas. And a lot of people in this country a lot of younger journalists in this country are saying, nope, we're not going to be bound by those old ideas. But now we have a problem. In principle, can I talk for a moment just about professionalism and what that means?
Yes.
Thank you. Because, we have this idea that journalism is a profession. Okay, I actually believe journalism is a profession. For a long time, however, journalists were more comfortable talking about the collective identity of journalists as being a trade or a craft, as it's called, right? But the idea, the essential idea of a profession, which now most younger journalists like to think of themselves as members of, the essential idea is that this isn't about serving the corporation. This isn't about making the boss more money. What journalism is at its core is a public service, at its core. So our accountability is not to do the boss's bidding, right? Well, the more gap there becomes between the owners of the press, or obviously to make it clear, by the press, of course, I include all of the digital platforms, both new and old, right? This idea of a gap between, the potential of a gap between the standards of the owners and the standards of the journalists raises the question, well, who establishes the professional standards of journalists as distinct from the standards of the people who employ them? And what it takes to be a profession involves understanding because it is a public service, whether it's engineers or nurses or midwives, because it's a profession, it has defining duties of care to the public, not to the bosses, to the public. And sometimes the interests, if the interests of the boss and the interests of the public, and the duties of the journalist or the members of the profession, when these things collide, the journalist has to be able to say, whoa, I could lose my license over this. In effect, I could lose my press card over this. You won't be employing a journalist if I have to do what you're telling me, right? Because my association, my peers will say, I'm no longer a journalist. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I was going to say,
Yeah,
so you're talking about a duty of care
Mhm.
that journalists, individual journalists, or journalists as a group owe to the public,
Yeah.
which I don't think is a new idea. It's something that journalists have down the ages told themselves was what set them apart. There's also a duty of care, though, which is being talked about more and more to the individual journalists themselves, and trying to square how one feels as an individual, as a citizen, about these fundamental issues and what the expectations are and by whom of how a journalist should comport themselves, right? And that's why we get to these standoffs between, can a journalist who supports what is going on with respect to Indigenous land rights participate as well as report? That's where it gets very sticky.
Yeah, and that's just one example of places where the assumption of journalists my age was that really largely what the editor says is news, for example. This is a story, okay? This is a story because people are interested in this story. This is news judgment, right? And what the editor says is news is, that's okay, because, you know, we all share the same values fundamentally, right? And of course, after all, the editor knows what their audiences want, right? Guess what? You know, we now know much more about what audiences want. And we also have come to the understanding in our world that journalists, the more diverse we get, the more communities we represent, the more kinds of people we are, the more interesting our lives stories are, the less we will agree on what is newsworthy and what is not, right? So these standoffs will continue, it seems to me, and are inevitable. If you were talking about a lawyer working for, let's say, the government of Alberta, or a nurse working for a hospital in Ottawa, when that person feels that believes that their professional duties are being obstructed by their boss, they have somewhere to go and make their stand. This is not true of journalists. That doesn't have to remain the case, in my opinion.
Okay, and you are making the case that we need professional standards. So let's talk about the places in the world where there are professional standards for journalists. How does it work? And what are the strengths and weaknesses of the systems in place?
Yeah. One of the big errors I think that Canadian Anglophone journalists have made has been to look to the United States of America, the UK, and other Anglophone dominated countries for an answer to that question, and say, you know what, press freedom unlimited has gotten us far, and we don't need to engage with questions like this. Our Quebec colleagues, but have other roots, other cultural roots, which make their approaches to thinking about this different, more diverse. Let us say, you know, some agree with the position that the last thing we would want is to be a self-regulated profession, and others are saying, well, maybe not a self-regulated profession, but some degree of professional status, some degree of official recognition of who we are and what binds us is a good thing. And of course, this came to a head in the year 2011 when the Quebec government of the day circulated a discussion paper, which had been largely authored or based on work by a very respected colleague of ours at Laval University, Dominique Payet, in which it was proposed to provide journalists in the province of Quebec with a professional status, as it's called, which is very similar to that which is provided in many countries of Western Europe. Democracies all, freedom of the press, countries all, right? And of course, Anglophone journalists just lost their shit at that moment, right? And a bucket of scorn came down on the Fédération des Journalistes de Québec for having easily and overwhelmingly welcomed this approach by the government of Quebec. It went nowhere, right? The Montreal Gazette came out against it and all kinds of others did, and that was that. That was 2011. That's the only time we have really at all looked to the European model in this country, and it was a disaster because of the Anglophone resistance. I don't think I've ever heard Scandinavian journalism communities discussed by journalists or journalism educators, mentioned by journalists or journalism educators in my career. I'm not sure about it.
I haven't.
Okay, well then let's just look at that. You know, let's look at that. The idea in all the Nordic countries, but I know a little bit more about the 4 Scandinavian countries than Iceland, so let me just stick with that. And I don't know a lot. I'm not an expert on this, right? But here's what I do know. in all those 4 countries, there is what I call a Nordic bargain that has been made, right? Actually here's another prop. I'm dying to read this book.
Ah, okay.
Because have you noticed how every bloody list or index of anything, whether it's happiest people in the world or freest people in the world or least income disparity in the world, whatever list you're looking at, the first 4 countries on the index are going to be the damn Scandinavians.
Right.
Isn't that irritating?
Got a lock on that.
Well, of course, the same is true of the World's Press Freedom Index, which is compiled by the Reporters Without Borders. Has been for years and years and years. The 4 Scandinavian countries were right at the top of the list. Why? Journalists don't get arrested. You can't think of any countries where journalists get arrested quite a bit. No, I can't either. You know, journalists don't get arrested. There are no conflicts between government and journalists. The government has no say over who is a journalist, or it never goes to court, you know, et cetera, et cetera. How do they make this work? Well, they make this work quite easily. They say, okay, for the cost, and it is a cost, for the cost of peer accountability, that I will be accountable to you and vice versa, and for the cost of having agreed to bury our differences, I would say hatchets, but they use something else in Scandinavia, to bury our differences and say we will all be members of some kind of common organization with a set of standards to which we consider ourselves bound, right? For that cost, we will get the benefit of widespread official, well, universal official recognition. My press card, here's a press card, final prop. Okay, my European Union press card, or for those not members of the European Union, the national press card, will gain me access to a courtroom where no court officer will ever say to me, put away your phone and stop tweeting, because guess what? Did I mention? I'm a journalist. And the government recognizes that the bearer of this card is a journalist. And the courts recognize that. And the cops recognize that. So yeah, there may be bad cops who think a journalist is a pain in the ass, but the question of who's a journalist doesn't arise, right? So that's the cost and the benefits. And by the way, there's been, you know, you remember how in this country, when the federal government decided it would like to give the press a little bit of money, not a lot of money, but a little bit of money, and how many years ago? 4 years ago? I can see you Googling.
Yeah, I'm not Googling. I have it in my notes here. I don't have the year, though.
A few years ago, before, certainly before the
It was a few years ago.
The federal government of the day decided, dear journalists, we know your business is in trouble. We would like to give you a little taxpayer money to keep your organizations alive, right? In various ways. There were a bunch of different government-funded initiatives, not a lot of money. Well, of course, we lost our shit over that too. And especially older journalists of my generation were like, you can't do that. That would tie us up with government. The Scandinavian countries have been funding newspapers, well, there were newspapers back when it started since the 1960s and 1970s, because there was no question. There was no more a question about taxpayer money going to subsidize journalism then in those countries than there has really ever been seriously about taxpayer money funding this country's biggest news organization, which is the CBC. So, you know, you can reconcile public money with a free press, as long as you've got something that is completely at arm's length, where the journalists correct journalism, as
Right.
in the words of William Pitt the Younger, around the turn of the 18th century, no, the 19th century, in Britain said, let journalists correct journalists. I'm not going to worry as Prime Minister about what journalists say or what they report, because other journalists will take care of that.
Okay, so before we go to Ange and questions, one last one for
Already.
you. I'd like to know from you how this would play out in Canada. As you know, we have a bunch of different associations and news organizations who have standards and practices and guidelines. How does it all come together? How do we even agree on something like, where you draw the line for conflict of interest?
Yeah, the funny thing is, Susan, we are so close in this country to being there. So the National News Media Council of Canada, to take an example, has something like 460 member organizations. You look down the list, which is on their website, of members of the National News Media Council. This is to their great credit, by the way, that this very young organization that took over from a bunch of disparate provincial press councils that were mostly going bankrupt and fading out, now has a membership of, four, I think it's 4. She's Googling again, I can tell. How many members, Susan?
I'm actually looking at the questions.
Okay, sorry. Stop it, Ivor. 459, I think it was last time I looked, members of this organization from the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail all the way to JSource, which you and I are somewhat involved in. It's a very small one-staff operation which reports on journalism, right? All of them members of this national organization. The Conseil de Presse de Quebec has obviously a smaller number of news organizations, but looking at their list, I could not actually think certainly of any recognized newspapers or news organizations that are not members of that council. So we already have a situation where somebody is in charge of adjudicating the standards of a very large number of journalists, with some very important exceptions. The aforementioned CBC, CTV, Global News, not members of the National News Media Council, although oddly, in a couple of those cases, their Quebec affiliates, not Quebec affiliates, I shouldn't call Radio-Canada a Quebec affiliate, it is the Francophone CBC is a member of the Conseil de Presse de Quebec. So go figure that out, right? It's confusing. And then what are the standards? Well, the National News Media Council is this close to saying we know what the standards are, because it says to its panels when the public complains about something, it says, go look at the organization's own standards. That's a problem for me, actually. But also look at the Canadian Association of Journalists ethics guidelines, that 2011 document we were talking about. Go look at those and you can make your judgments based on that. So we have informally something quite close, right? Here's the problem. Do you know how many members the Canadian Association of Journalists has? I
don't.
Yeah, about 1,000.
Ah.
Grade A members is what they call active journalists, right? The FIJAQ, which represents the journalists of only one province, has 1,650 members, active journalists as its membership. So that's more than the national associations. Do you know how many members at last count oh man, was it the Finns or the Swedes? Damn, I have it somewhere. I don't remember. Forgive me, all my Scandinavian friends, especially the ones who know that Finland and Sweden are so not the same country. I believe it's the Finnish Association of Journalists has 14,000 members. Okay, and there's only one of them. And guess what? If you want to get a press card in Finland, you're going to have to join. Okay, and guess what? The Press Council of Finland will look at your association standards, the Journalists Association, the Journalists Union standards, and say, according to those standards, you messed up, Susan Harada, right? And if you messed up real bad, there will be a sanction on your news, on your publication. So that's something, right? That's something. So the Canadian Association of Journalists had more members and could figure it out with the FPJQ to, maybe have a common code of ethics. Are our standards so different in the two jurisdictions between these two to have a common standard of ethics? And if the National News Media Council and the Conseil de Presse de Quebec could figure out how to actually just talk to each other and say, you know what, we're willing to do that too, to use the same code, then we're really this close to a situation where we have a critical mass of journalists who are associated either with those organizations or with news media who are members of those organizations. Really, it doesn't make that much difference. And then we have a situation where we don't need a gate 3 for the aforementioned Federal Debates Commission, right? We just have 2 gates. You're either accountable to your peers for your standards or you're not. What am I missing?
Well, good question. We will go to questions from our audience right now, and maybe they're asking you the same thing. Ange, I wonder if you could throw some out there.
Yeah, the first question is from George, and George would like to know your thoughts. Is Julian Assange and or Fox News reporters considered journalists?
What a fantastic question, George. And sorry, Susan, were you supposed to like adjudicate between me and George?
I don't think so. I think you can handle that.
Okay, all right. So let me just say to George, that is an amazing question. What is especially wonderful about your question is the way you put 2 people, 2 groups together into the same question. And I think, for the record, that's what we would be looking at if we're talking about professional standards, that we can judge Julian Assange and anybody at Fox News who calls themselves a journalist by the same set of standards, right? To ensure that we are not actually being ruled by our biases as to whether we prefer Julian Assange's biases to the biases of the Fox News journalists. So again, Ange, do you mind just reading? I just tell me again the wording of George's question about Fox and Julian Assange. Oh, do I consider them journalists, right?
That's correct.
That's right.
Thanks. So it's an incredibly, well, first of all, the easy one is there's no such thing as the Fox News journalists. There are journalists working for Fox News who are journalists, and there are sort of entertainers, current affairs hosts working for Fox News who clearly are not journalists any more, by the way, than Chris Cuomo is working for CNN and a bunch of others working for CNN. These people are there to do some job of work for their bosses, make money for their bosses in a way that is really quite distinct from journalism, in my opinion. And if anybody wants, I can try to expound why. The Julian Assange question is quite a lot more complicated. Because, well, you know what, I'm just going to go to the, let me just say, I don't really think, again, it doesn't matter what I think of your question, George. What matters is what a court made of it in the United Kingdom this February, right? So an extradition court in the United Kingdom this February is asked, a judge in the United Kingdom is asked to decide whether Julian Assange may be extradited to the United States of America to face a charge of, get this, treason, sedition, right? If Julian Assange, of course, is the brains behind WikiLeaks, okay, so has released state secrets and found state secrets, aggregated state secrets, and then worked with the New York Times and the Guardian and other organizations to bring those national security classified that information before the general public. The British Union of Journalists said to the court in the United Kingdom, this guy is a journalist. In fact, they used the word, the submission used the word, his work, what he did with WikiLeaks with respect to the United States documents, records, was identical, they said, to the work of a journalist. So that, at any rate, was their opinion. Okay. Most people I know wouldn't have said identical, but the question is where you draw a line, right? The court, here's what is interesting. The court disagreed, did not accept the position of the British Union of Journalists. In fact, didn't accept any of the defense positions with respect to what Julian Assange did. But it refused his extradition to the United States on the basis of this rather frail and troubled man would be put into a maximum security prison in the United States, probably for the rest of his life, if the extradition was granted and if he was convicted in the United States. So she said, that's extreme, and I'm not going to let it happen. Okay. But basically, she said, he's not a journalist. So once again, in the United Kingdom, there was no way to resolve that question either, because the United Kingdom works pretty much as we do. The United Kingdom also, by the way, has 2 press councils, even though they don't even have 2 languages. But, you know, it's very confusing in the United Kingdom who a journalist is as well.
And before we go on to the next question, I'd just like to throw one in here to you, Ivor. I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know how well you are familiar or how deeply familiar you are with the Finnish standards, but how would that question be answered in Finland about a Fox News reporter and about Julian Assange?
Well, wait, you mean if they were Finnish journalists, right? How would that question be answered?
Yeah, or if you're a Finnish person answering that question.
I don't know how a Finnish person would answer the question any better than I did about Julian Assange, who is an Australian, and the Fox people who are Americans mostly. But I do know how they would answer the question about Finns.
Okay.
That's the end of that.
So a Finnish version of a Fox News reporter and of Julian Assange in Finland would be accredited.
They would only be accredited if their peers considered them journalists.
Would they be? Would their peers consider them journalists?
I don't know. But you see, the thing about this is that if we, and this is where the tricky question about self-regulation is, and this is an excellent question you're asking, right? Because self-regulation, you haven't used the term, I noticed, you're too polite, Susan, but that's what we're talking about here, some form of self-regulation. Right? Self-regulation doesn't stop only at having standards that are on paper. It represents accountability to those standards and accountability to your peers based on those standards. Now, is that a completely foreign concept in Canada? Actually, no, because we're probably both quite familiar with the idea of the press gallery of the Canadian Parliament, or the press gallery of all the legislatures in Canada, which are self-regulatory bodies, where the press gallery must decide who is and who isn't a journalist, and does decide who is and who isn't a journalist, based on their own standards of practice. And if someone breaks those standards, they stand to lose their press gallery membership. It is not a long way from that situation to saying that some people who have a press card in Canada, if we ever get there, will stand to lose that press card if their peers determine that they have broken the standards of the association.
Right, and sort of going circularly here, before we go back to Ange, the press gallery, and I'm not Googling, I'm looking at my notes here, does rely on the values and codes of conduct developed by other professional associations as well, such as the CHA, right? So there must be some common ground out there. Ange, over to you.
Yeah, the next an attendee says, in an article she published several years ago, Amy Gaja, an American journalist turned law professor, attributed the willingness of courts to grant great leeway for press freedom in significant part because of the commitment of mainstream newsrooms to professional codes of ethics. With the progressive demise of mainstream media as a result of its failing business model, how are professional, ethical, journalistic standards going to be sustained in the era of ungated content?
Yeah, well, thank you. That's exactly my question. I see a real crisis, a crash coming in the idea of, look, actually, it isn't. Let's again be kind of candid with each other, with oneself. This crisis of trust not in journalists. I don't think anyone should trust a journalist any more than they should trust a doctor. It's like trust but verify, right? But the idea of trust that there is such a thing as a journalist, that there is such a thing, excuse me, in facts, in the news media. The idea, that kind of trust, that has crashed. That crash has come. I want to recommend a really terrific edition of This American Life. About a year ago, I think, but again, one can Google it very easily. And Susan, I will never accuse you of Googling again. It was called something like Fear and Loathing in Homer, Alaska. But if one Googles Homer, Alaska, This American Life, you get there. And what they did was they followed a man who was just a regular citizen of a tiny town that is literally at the end of the road of the United States of America. It is literally at the end of the last highway, the northernmost highway in the United States, called Homer, Alaska. And Homer, Alaska, some bright spark on the town council or whatever they call it there, in this very small town, decided that Homer, Alaska should become a refugee, what do they call it? A city of refuge for refugees, a place where refugees are welcome. Well, as far as anyone in Homer, Alaska could tell the reporter, the This American Life reporter, there had never been a refugee in Homer, Alaska. It's a very unlikely place to go and seek refuge, but they decided as a matter of principle, we want this to happen. So a gentleman in the town is like, and this matter is put up for a referendum of the, 17 residents of Homer, obviously exaggerating. And he says, well, I want to find out. There must be a reason why people are for this, and there must be a reason why people are against it, because of course the town had blown up, people taking side of this. And he set out to find out the truth about allegations made, about when the refugees come, crime rates go up, and who are the refugees, just to find out some facts. And This American Life tracked his progress in trying to find out facts. And he's like, well, there's this on the internet, there's this Breitbart news and they say X, Y, Z. But then some of my friends say you can't believe Breitbart news. But they say this, and then, the New York Times, it says, but some of my friends says you can't believe the New York Times, right? And this person of goodwill had no objective way to distinguish between misinformation and journalism. So it's not just about the courts. It's also about regular citizens trying to draw these lines. And we are not helping them either with all these media literacy things that I don't understand, frankly, how media literacy is supposed to work. How about just telling them this place employs only journalists who are subject to a set of standards? That would be cool.
Anj, you have any more for us?
Yeah, I do. The next question from Chris. Chris says, you are both professors of journalism. How much are students in your schools taught the ethical standards of the profession they are going to be entering? And what are they told about the consequences of failing to uphold these standards?
How about giving me a break, Susan?
This is your conversation, Ivor. I will say at Carleton, where I work, we do have a specific ethics course for all of our students. So all of them have to go through that. But ethics and the discussion of ethics are embedded in all of our courses from first year right through to fourth. Everything they do, every assignment, every question they ask, every action they take, we always ask them to look at it through the frame of ethics. Is this ethical behavior for a journalist? And there are some really interesting conversations going on because, Ivor, as you noted, society changes. Society is always static. What we value, what we put emphasis on, that is always changing as well. And I have to say, our students keep us on our toes as a faculty.
Yeah. And all I'm going to say is what Susan said with respect to the school that I've taught in for 20 years, which is Rice, and absolutely what you said.
Oh, and we do talk about consequences, everything from the personal to the people they impact, to consequences for themselves as journalists when we get into plagiarism and professional standards in that sense.
Right, or deceiving a source, for example. You know, saying to a source one thing about why you're interviewing them when actually you're interviewing them for something else entirely. That would be academic and non-academic misconduct at respect to the university.
Ange, back to you.
Yeah, the next question from an attendee, they say the Canadian press is following suit to the propaganda news audiences, much like the US, and to a greater extent, China. CBC is noted as biased towards socialism and negating capitalistic perspectives. So how is this not simply the extension of the already widely accepted prerogatives of other countries? Aren't we already failing in terms of pushing the delusional view that journalism isn't biased already, or perhaps has always been biased?
Well, you know, there are parts of that question I just simply disagree with. My opinion is that the CBC does not push a socialist agenda, you know, so that is a matter of opinion, of course. But you know, I'm sorry, I really have a problem with questions always, and I have to often ask my students to repeat them. The second half of the question, can you just remind me the second half of the question after the bit about, oh, it's about bias, right? Sorry, of course. You know, journalists' bias. So journalists' bias, of course, is not a new problem. Journalists' bias is as old as journalism or older. You know, every creator of anything, every investigator of anything, whether it's a chemist, you know, or a public health expert, or a patient, you know, no matter, we're all biased. We all bring our life experience to what we're looking into and what we're trying to communicate. The greatest journalist in the world, if there were such a thing, and the worst journalist in the world would probably be equally biased. Obviously, we all have different biases formed by our lives, right? The thing that is a matter of standards for most professions, not just journalism, but certainly for journalism, is to take your biases, recognize them, and control for them, so that the product you're putting out is aware, is built on some kind of quality system that takes as a given the fact that as a human being you will be biased, right? That is what we teach our students, I believe, is to say, okay, this is your world, these are your assumptions. But if you're going out to try to find information and then disseminating that information to the public, there are standards that apply to that process. And one of them, of course, is to find other points of view and other perceptions of truth and fact. We talked a lot about that in another panel last week, actually. So the standard of verification is thought to be something that journalists should hold themselves up to. How well that standard is actually implemented in practice is a matter for some, has always been a matter for some questioning. And I do believe that there's a large amount of ritual, of creedal kind of faith and confidence in ourselves and in our peers that is attached to this idea of journalism as a discipline of verification. I would love to see clearer standards about what constitutes verification and especially what needs to be verified. Because if we're going to make a case to the world that that the products of a news medium that consists of the work of journalists is somehow going to be somewhat more reliable than the products of an organization that doesn't employ journalists, well, then I think we could make a better case, frankly, right now than we do about the degree to which our journalists consistently apply standards of verification to their work.
Okay, thank you, Ivor. Anj, do we have any others?
Yeah, the next question is from Robin, and Robin asks, you have made reference to journalist professional standards, but do they exist in any meaningful way in the absence of a professional association of journalists that has the power to enforce these standards, equivalent to professional bodies for doctors, nurses, social workers, and lawyers, among others?
At last, a question that I can just answer with one word: no.
You want to expand on that a little, Ivor?
I think I have. I think I've said that to use the word standards meaningfully, you do have to have some way of peer accountability. If it's a profession, and we do not in this country have a meaningful form of peer accountability, not corporate accountability, but peer accountability, we need to acknowledge the cost of that is that the answer to this question is no. Yeah, I mean, you know, when a Utah nurse some years ago, there was an invasion of cops into an emergency room, that she was the only healthcare professional in the place, and it was in Utah. I don't remember anything about where in Utah, but in Utah, and the cops said, "This guy, we need a blood sample from him." Okay, and the guy was unconscious, right? Their prisoner, their captive. We need a blood sample from him. And you, being a nurse, we want you to take the blood sample because you wouldn't want us to take a blood sample, right? And the nurse not only refused to take a blood sample from a patient who had not given consent, she stood in the way between these police officers and her patient. Why? Because she was a hero? Maybe. But actually because it was a professional standard, right? She is accountable for her license as a nurse to certain standards, and you do not provide medical care to someone without their consent. End of story.
Right, and to get back to your point, accountable to her peers, not to the hospital where she worked, regardless of whether the hospital had rules about that sort of thing.
Exactly, and not even accountable to the direct order of a police officer in Utah.
Anj, back to you.
We have one more question, another one from George, and George asks, is journalist objectivity a myth?
Damn, George, I gave you such a great answer last time, and now you've ruined it with that word, the O word. I'm sorry, George, I'm going to buy you a drink sometime if you identify yourself to me, okay? To make up for this abuse.
I hope you know George.
I have no idea, George. But if he writes to me, I'll treat him nice. Look, journalist objectivity, any objectivity is a myth. There is no such thing as an objective human being. There is an idea out there somewhere that you can define an objective method, and that's what, for example, scientists seek and judges in courts seek, but I don't think journalists are really that kind of person, and I don't think our profession involves that kind of person. I think what we can, and by the way, I actually don't personally know any journalism teachers, or, I don't know any journalism teachers for sure who teach their students that they can aspire to this neutral intellectual state of objectivity. What we can aspire to is to be self-critical about our work. And that is a standard, that you don't simply report something as a truth because somebody you like or somebody whose views you like has told you that is a truth. And you don't simply eliminate the possibility that something is true when it is told to you by someone you don't like, right? Or whose views are generally despicable to you. That's where journalism gets into trouble sometimes in its news selection, in its idea, the idea that, we talked a little bit, Susan, about news judgment earlier, that in the old days, it used to be assumed that someone in a news organization knew what audiences wanted, what was a story and what was not a story. This is where bias comes in very immediately. This crime in this neighborhood is a story. This crime in that neighborhood isn't, right? And that's not unfortunately, that's not a made up. That I didn't make that up. That's actually how a lot of journalists over the years have been told their stories suck, their story ideas suck, and they shouldn't go and report this because it's not news and so forth. Subjecting that idea to criticism, that idea that I know anything, whether it's what the audience wants, or I know in advance what how the story is going to turn out, without submitting it to the discipline of verification, that idea is what needs reassessment. You don't know what the story is going to yield. And any really good journal, I mean, Susan Harada used to be, when I was in Newfoundland, in a little outport when I first came to this country, and we had our whole village, our whole town, 400 people, had a satellite dish, one that we all shared, that I think the government provided. And it brought us 2 channels, CBC and NTV, which is the Newfoundland affiliate of CTV. That's it. And hopefully some of the time, definitely not daily, we would get a hold of a copy of the St. John's Telegram, and that was it. That was my exposure to news from Canada. And I remember listening to, we certainly made a date to listen to watch the National every night, the CBC National, and it used to be followed by a program called The Journal, which was a magazine show with longer, more documentary material. And there were these voices that came in from Toronto, from Vancouver, from Inuvik, from Paris. And they would end with something like Susan Harada, CBC News, Paris, or wherever, right? And I believed what Susan was telling me because I believed I could see that the work done, I thought, I felt, still feel, the work done was the kind of thing that subjects people's ideas of truth to some kind of examination, right? That is the nature of belief that one wants to have in a democracy when people look at the work of journalists. It has become much more difficult to believe in professional standards because the world has changed. Angela Merkel campaigned, last sentence, okay? Angela Merkel campaigned election after election after election with great success, as we all know, on the idea, and she was a conservative, let us not forget, Angela Merkel was a conservative politician, and she campaigned on the idea that circumstances change, and we need to change with changing circumstances. My worry, Susan, is that we journalists have seen the circumstances change all around us for the last 20 years at least, and have been willing to change nothing about our fundamental approach to the conduct of our profession. And it is time. It's time to change.
Thank you, Ivor. Really powerful answer. Very powerful. I'm told Ange does have a few more questions. So Ange,
I wouldn't have
back to
spoken so
you.
long.
Yeah, the next question is from Jenna, and Jenna says, many journalists in Canada are unionized. What role do journalists' unions play in setting and upholding professional standards?
Look, they play a big role when a journalist is in that hypothetical situation I set out, where a boss, an owner, is asking a journalist to do something that according to the journalist and according to their peers within the organization would be against their professional standards, right? The unionization of journalists in that situation is vital. However, many journalists are not unionized anymore. Many journalists work for an organization, a major national news organization that is not unionized. Many journalists work for small operations that will never be unionized because there are only 2 or 3 journalists in the operation, if even 2. So that's where the unionization, I think, is very important, but it isn't ever going to be the full answer. I did mention that it is the National Union of Journalists in each of the Scandinavian countries which actually sets the standard, and the standard by which the Press Council in each of those 4 countries adjudicates public complaints, right? Swedish Press Council can fine a news organization for breach of standards, right? And it's the journalists' standards that are being breached. So I think if the unions, and that's a problem in this country, is that we have 2 big Anglophone unions and more unions in Quebec, who I don't think they compete as much as they used to, but certainly if they could collaborate, we'd be talking not of numbers like the ones I mentioned about the CAJ and the FPJQ. We'd be talking about, I think, probably 5,000 to 8,000 journalists in this country are either working for news organizations that submit themselves to the press councils, or for the various journalists' unions. If they could collaborate in these matters, we would be so much closer to a solution on the question of professional standards.
Okay, thank you. Ange.
Yeah, the next question is from Max, and Max asks, Ivor has advocated for a professional standards body for journalists, but as we have seen repeatedly, these bodies act more to protect the interests of their members than the interests of the public. Why do you feel it would be different in the case of journalists?
I'm not sure I have seen that, Max, to be honest. That is not my experience. If a doctor is hauled before the College of Physicians and Surgeons for any kind of abuse of standards, that doctor is quite likely to be sanctioned and potentially lose their job as a result. I don't see that these standards organizations necessarily only protect their members. But, you know, by the way, I'm also not saying that you shouldn't be able to practice journalism without a press card. That would be a contravention of free press. But I do think that if we got together as journalists and said these are our standards, we could put our mind to creating a mechanism whereby we could be upheld, we could be accountable against those standards. Perhaps I'm wrong, but, I just wonder what the alternative is.
It would have to have some built-in transparency to a process like that. And I've sort of lost track. I'm not sure whether we have any more questions.
Or time.
Yeah, well, I think at 5:30, it's probably okay to go back to Jim now.
Oh, it is 5:30. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for your questions. And back to you, Jim.
Well, I want to thank you, Susan, and you, Ivor, for a really engaging conversation. You ranged over a number of important issues, I think articulated some challenging, interesting positions very clearly. And so I'm grateful to you, and I'm grateful to the audience for tuning into this conversation. A video recording of this will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website either tomorrow afternoon or the following morning. Our website is cfe.ryerson.ca. As well, we will post some suggested additional readings, YouTube videos, or other material for those who would like to explore the issues that have been discussed today in a little greater depth. For our next event, which will be held a week from today, that's Wednesday, December 8th, it's going back to our series entitled Taming Big Tech, What Are the Alternatives? And the title is How Should Democracies Regulate Speech Online? And our guest is a really eminent Canadian lawyer, Jamil Jafar, who is currently the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. And formerly he was the deputy legal director for the American Civil Liberties Union, where he oversaw the ACLU's work relating to free speech, privacy, technology, national security, and international human rights, all issues related to the regulation of the platforms and of social media. So if you're interested in this issue, as I hope you are, tune in next Wednesday, December 8th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. For more information about this event, any of our other upcoming events, or any of our many past events, again, go to our website, cfe.ryerson.ca. For now, I just want to thank you for tuning in today and hope to see you again at a future event. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.